The enemy followed him to that house, fully determined to seize and slay him. The clamour of the people that had massed around his house compelled Wahid to order Mullah Muhammad Rizai-i Manshadi, one of the most enlightened ulamas of Manshad, who had discarded his turban and offered himself as his doorkeeper, to sally forth and, with the aid of his 6 companions, whom he would choose, to scatter their forces. "Let each one of you raise his voice," he commanded them, "and repeat 7 times the word Allahu Akbar, and on your 7th invocation spring forward at one and the same moment into the midst of your assailants." Allahu Akbar means God is the most great. Mullah Muhammad Riza, whom Baha'u'llah had named Razar Ruh, sprang to his feet and with his companions straightway proceeded to fulfill the instructions he had received. Those who accompanied him, though frail of form and inexperienced in the art of swordsmanship, were fired with a faith that made them the terror of their adversaries. 7 of the most redoubtable among the enemy perished that day, which was the 27th of the month of Jamadiyuth Thani, the 10th of May, AD 1850. No sooner had we routed the enemy, Mullah Muhammad Riza related, and returned to the house of Wahid, and we found Muhammad Abdullah lying wounded before us. He was carried to our leader, and partook of the food with which the latter had been served. Afterwards he was borne to a hiding place, where he remained concealed until he recovered from his wound. Eventually he was seized and slain by the enemy. That very night Wahid bade his companions disperse and exercise the utmost vigilance to secure their safety. He advised his wife to remove, with her children and all their belongings, to the home of her father, and to leave behind whatever was his personal property. "This palatial residence," he informed her, "I have built with the sole intention that it should be eventually demolished in the path of the cause, and the stately furnishings with which I have adorned it have been purchased in the hope that one day I shall be able to sacrifice them for the sake of my beloved. Then will friend and foe alike realize that he who owned this house was endowed with so great and priceless a heritage, that an earthly mansion, however sumptuously adorned and magnificently equipped, had no worth in his eyes, that it had sunk in his estimation to the state of a heap of bones to which only the dogs of the earth could feel attracted." Would that such compelling evidence of the spirit of renunciation were able to open the eyes of this perverse people, and to stir in them the desire to follow in the steps of him who had showed that path. In the mid-watches of that same night, Wahid arose, and collecting the writings of the Bab that were in his possession, as well as the copies of all the treatises that he himself had composed, entrusted them to his servant Hassan, and ordered him to convey them to a place outside the gate of the city where the road branches off to Miriz. He bade him await his arrival, and warned him that were he to disregard his instructions, he would never again be able to meet him. No sooner had Hassan mounted his horse and prepared to leave, than the cries of the sentinels who kept watch at the entrance of the fort reached his ears. Fearing lest they should capture him and seize the precious manuscripts in his possession, he decided to follow a different route from the one which his master had instructed him to take. As he was passing behind the fort, the sentinels recognized him, shot his horse, and captured him. Meanwhile, Wahid was preparing to depart from Yazd, leaving his 2 sons, Syed Ismail and Syed Ali Muhammad, in the care of their mother. He left accompanied by his 2 other sons, Syed Ahmad and Syed Mihdi, together with 2 of his companions, who were both residents of Yazd, and had asked permission to accompany him on his journey. The first, who was named Ghulam Riza, was a man of exceptional courage, while the latter, Ghulam Rizai-i Kushik, had distinguished himself in the art of marksmanship. He chose the same route that he had advised his servant to take, and arriving safely at that spot, was surprised to find that Hassan was missing. Wahid knew immediately that he had disregarded his directions and had been captured by the enemy. He deplored his fate, and was reminded of the action of Muhammad Abdullah, who had similarly acted against his will and had in consequence suffered injury. They were subsequently informed that on the morning of that same day Hassan was blown from the mouth of a cannon, and that a certain Mirza Hassan, who had been the imam of one of the quarters of Yazd, and who was a man of renowned piety, had an hour later also been captured and subjected to the same fate as his comrade. A footnote here says, "When they would have bound him with his back towards the gun, he said," and this is Hassan, "Bind me, I pray you, with my face towards the gun, that I may see it fired." The gunners and those who stood looking on were all astonished at his composure and cheerfulness, and indeed one who can be cheerful in such a plight must needs have great faith and fortitude. From the Tarikh-i-Jadid, page 117. The departure of Wahid from Yazd roused the enemy to fresh exertions. They rushed to his house, plundered his possessions, and demolished it completely. He himself was meanwhile directing his steps towards Neriz. Though unaccustomed to walking, he covered that night 7 farsangs on foot, while his sons were carried part of the way by his 2 companions. In the course of the ensuing day he concealed himself within the recess of a neighbouring mountain. As soon as his brother, who resided in that vicinity, and entertained a deep affection for him, was informed of his arrival, he secretly dispatched to him whatever provisions he required. That same day a body of the governor's mounted attendants, who had set out in pursuit of Wahid, arrived at that village, searched the house of his brother, where they suspected that he was concealed, and appropriated a large amount of his property. Unable to find him, they retraced their steps to Yazd. Wahid, in the meantime, made his way through the mountains until he reached the district of Babanat-i-Fars. Most of its inhabitants, who were numbered among his fervent admirers, readily embraced the cause, among whom was a well-known Hajid Sid Ismail, the Sheikhul Islam of Babanat. A considerable number of these people accompanied him as far as the village of Fasar, where the inhabitants refused to respond to the message which he invited them to follow. All along his route, wherever he tarried, Wahid's first thought, as soon as he dismounted, was to seek the neighbouring masjid, wherein he would summon the people to hear him announce the tidings of the new day. Utterly oblivious of the fatigues of his journey, he would promptly ascend the pulpit and fearlessly proclaim to his congregation the character of the faith he had risen to champion. He would spend only 1 night in that place if he had succeeded in winning to the cause souls upon whom he would rely to propagate it after his departure. Otherwise, he would straightway resume his march and refuse further to associate with them. "Through whichever village I pass," he often remarked, "and fail to inhale from its inhabitants the fragrance of belief, its food and its drink are both distasteful to me." Arriving at the village of Runiz, in the district of Fasar, Wahid decided to tarry for a few days. Those hearts which he found receptive to his call he strove to attract and to inflame with the fire of God's love. As soon as the news of his arrival reached Neriz, the entire population of the Shinar Sukti quarter hastened out to meet him. People from other quarters likewise, impelled by their love and admiration for him, decided to join them. Fearing lest Zainul Abidin Khan, the governor of Neriz, should object to their visit, the majority of them set out at night. From the quarter of Shinar Sukti alone, more than 100 students, preceded by their leader Haji Sheikh Abdul Ali, the father-in-law of Wahid, and a judge of recognized standing throughout that district, were moved to join a number of the most distinguished among the notables of Neriz in greeting the expected visitor ere his arrival at their town. Among these figured Mullah Abdul Hussein, a venerable man of 80 who was highly esteemed for his piety and learning, Mullah Bakir, who was the imam of the Shinar Sukti quarter, Mirza Hussein-i Qutb, the Kadkuda of the Bazar quarter, and all his relatives, Mirza Abdul Qasim, a relative of the governor, Haji Muhammad Taqi, who has been mentioned by Baha'u'llah in the Suri-i Ayub, together with his son-in-law, Mirza Nawra and Mirza Ali Riza, both of the Sadat quarter. All of these, some by day and others by night, went as far as the village of Runiz in order to extend their welcome to the visitor, and to assure him of their unalterable devotion. Although the Bab had revealed a general tablet addressed specially to those who had newly embraced his cause in Neriz, yet its recipients remained ignorant of its significance and fundamental principles. It was given to Wahid to enlighten them regarding its true purpose and set forth its distinguishing features. No sooner had Zainul Abidin Khan been made aware of the considerable exodus that had taken place for the purpose of welcoming the arrival of Wahid Then he dispatched a special messenger to overtake and inform those who had already departed of his determination to take the life, capture the wives, and confiscate the property of everyone who persisted in giving allegiance to him. Not one of those who departed heeded the warning, but rather did they cling still more passionately to their leader. Their unyielding determination and disdainful neglect of his messenger filled the governor with dismay. Fearful lest these should arise against him, he decided to transfer his residence to the village of Khutre, where his original home had been, and which lay at a distance of 8 farsangs from Neyriz. He chose that village because in its vicinity there stood a massive fortress, which he could utilize as a place of refuge in case of danger. He was, moreover, assured that its inhabitants were trained in the art of marksmanship and could be relied upon whenever summoned to defend him. Vahid had meanwhile left Runiz for the shrine of Pir Murad, which was situated outside the village of Istabanat. Despite the interdiction pronounced by the ulamas of that village against his admittance, no less than 20 of its inhabitants went out to welcome him and accompanied him as far as Neyriz. When they arrived in the forenoon of the 15th of Rajab, the 27th of May, AD 1850, the first thing Vahid did, as soon as he reached his native quarter of Chinar Sukti, even before going to his own house, was to enter the masjid and summon the congregation that had gathered to acknowledge and embrace the message of the Bab. Impatient to face the multitude that awaited him, still wearing the dust-laden garments, he ascended the pulpit and spoke with such convincing eloquence that the whole audience was electrified by his appeal. No less than 1,000 persons, all natives of the Chinar Sukti quarter, and 500 others from other sections of Neyriz, all of whom had thronged the building, spontaneously responded, "We have heard and we obey," cried with unrestrained enthusiasm the jubilant multitude as they came forward to assure him of their homage and gratitude. The spell which that impassioned address threw over the hearts of those who heard it was such as Neyriz had never before experienced. My sole purpose, Vahid went on, explaining to his audience, as soon as the first flush of excitement had subsided, in coming to Neyriz, is to proclaim the cause of God. I thank and glorify him for having enabled me to touch your hearts with his message. No need for me to tarry any longer in your midst, for if I prolong my stay, I fear that the governor will ill-treat you because of me. He may seek reinforcement from Shiraz and destroy your homes and subject you to untold indignities. We are ready and resigned to the will of God, answered with one voice the congregation. God grant us his grace to withstand the calamities that may yet befall us. We cannot, however, reconcile ourselves to so abrupt and hasty a separation from you. No sooner had these words escaped their lips than men and women joined hands in conducting Vahid triumphantly to his home. Wild with excitement and exultant with joy, they pressed round him and with cheers and acclamations escorted him to the very entrance of his house. The few days Vahid consented to tarry in Neyriz were spent mostly in the masjid, where he continued with his customary eloquence and without the least reservation to propound the fundamental teachings which he had received from his master. Every day witnessed an increase in the number of his audience, and from every side evidences of his marvelous influence became more and more manifest. The fascination which he exerted over the people could not fail to fan to fury the dormant hostility of Zainul Abidin Khan. He was roused to new exertions and gave orders that an army be raised for the avowed purpose of eradicating a cause which he felt was fast undermining his own position. He soon succeeded in recruiting about 1,000 men, consisting of both cavalry and infantry, all of whom were well trained in the art of warfare and were equipped with an ample store of munitions. His plan was, by a sudden onset, to make him a prisoner. Vahid, as soon as he was informed of the designs of the governor, ordered those 20 companions who had left Istabanat to welcome him, and who had accompanied him as far as Neyriz, to occupy the fort of Qajir, which was situated in the vicinity of the Chinar Sukti quarter. He appointed Sheikh Hadi, son of Sheikh Muhsin, as the leader of the band, and urged his followers who resided in that quarter to fortify the gates, the turrets, and the walls of that stronghold. The governor had meanwhile transferred his seat to his own house in the bazaar quarter. The force he had raised accompanied him and occupied the fort situated in its vicinity. Its towers and walls, which he began to reinforce, overlooked the whole town. Having compelled Syed Abu Talib, the Qadquda of that quarter, and one of the companions of Wahid to evacuate his house, he fortified its roof, and stationing upon it a number of his men, under the command of Muhammad Ali Khan, he gave orders to open fire upon his adversary. The first to suffer was that same Mullah Abdul Hussein, who, despite his advanced age, had walked out to welcome Wahid. He was offering his prayer on the roof of his house when a bullet struck his right foot, causing him to bleed profusely. That cruel blow evoked the sympathy of Wahid, who hastened in a written message to the sufferer to express his grief at the injury he had sustained, and to cheer him with the thought that he, at this advanced stage of his life, was the first to be chosen to fall a victim in the path of the cause. The suddenness of the attack dismayed a number of the companions who had hastily embraced the message, and had failed to appreciate its full meaning. Their faith was so severely shaken that a few were induced, in the dead of night, to separate themselves from their companions and join forces with the enemy. Wahid had no sooner been informed of their action than he arose at the hour of dawn, and, mounting his steed, and accompanied by a number of his supporters, rode out to the fort of Qajri, where he fixed his residence. His arrival was the signal for a fresh attack upon him. Zainul Abidin Khan immediately dispatched his elder brother, Ali Asghar Khan, together with 1,000 men, all armed and well trained, to lay siege to that fort, in which 72 companions had already taken shelter. At the hour of sunrise, a certain number of them, acting in accordance with the instructions of Wahid, sallied forth, and with extraordinary rapidity forced the besiegers to disperse. No more than 3 of the companions met their death in the course of that encounter. The first was Tajud Din, a man renowned for his fearlessness, whose business was the manufacture of the woolen kulla. The second was Zainil, son of Iskandar, who was an agriculturalist by profession. The third was Mirza Abul Qasim, who was a man of distinguished merit. This complete and sudden rout aroused the apprehensions of Prince Firuz Mirza, the Nusratud Dawli, governor of Shiraz, who gave orders for the prompt extermination of the occupants of the fort. Zainul Abidin Khan dispatched one of the prince's attendants to Wahid, urging him, in view of the strained relations between them, to depart from Nayriz, in the hope that the mischief that had been kindled might soon be extinguished. "Tell him," replied Wahid, "that my 2 children, together with their 2 attendants, are all the company I have with me. If my presence in this town will cause mischief, I am willing to depart. Why is it that instead of according us the welcome which befits the descendant of the Prophet, he has deprived us of water, and has incited his men to besiege and attack us? If he persists in denying us the necessities of life, I warn him that 7 of my companions, whom he regards as the most contemptible among men, will inflict upon his combined forces a humiliating defeat." Finding that Zainul Abidin Khan ignored his warning, Wahid ordered his companions to emerge from the fort and punish their assailants. With admirable courage and confidence, they succeeded, though extremely young in years and utterly inexperienced in the use of arms, in demoralizing a trained and organized army. Ali Asghar Khan himself perished, and 2 of his sons were captured. Zainul Abidin Khan disgracefully retreated, with what still remained of his scattered forces, to the village of Kutri, acquainted the prince with the gravity of the situation, and begged him to send immediate reinforcements, stressing in particular the need for heavy artillery and a large detachment of both infantry and cavalry. Wahid, on his part, finding that the enemy was bent on their extermination, gave orders that the defences of the fort be strengthened, that a water cistern be constructed within its enclosure, and that the tents they had carried away be pitched outside its gates. That day certain of his companions had assigned to them special functions and duties. Kabilai Mirza Muhammad was made the gatekeeper of the fort, Sheikh Yusuf, custodian of the funds, Kabilai Muhammad, son of Shamsuddin, the superintendent of the gardens adjoining the fort and its barricades. Mirza Ahmad, the uncle of Ali Isa Dar, was appointed the officer in charge of the tower of the mill, known by the name of Chinar, situated in the vicinity of the fort. Sheikh-e Shivikash to be the executioner. Mirza Muhammad Jafar, cousin of Zainul Abidin Khan, the chronicler. Mirza Fadlullah, as the reader of these records. Mashhadi Taqi Bakal, to be the jailer. Haji Muhammad Taqi, the registrar, and Ghulam Rizai-e-Yazdi, to be the captain of the forces. In addition to the 72 companions who were with him within the fort and had accompanied him from Istanbanat to Neriz, Vahid was induced, at the instance of Sayyid Jafar-e-Yazdi, a well-known divine, and Sheikh Abdul Ali, Vahid's father-in-law, to admit to the fort a number of the residents of the Bazaar quarter, together with several of his own kindred. Zainul Abidin Khan again renewed his appeal to the prince, and enclosed this time with his petition, which pleaded for urgent and adequate reinforcements, the sum of 5,000 tumans as his personal gift to him. He entrusted his letter to one of his intimate friends, Mullah Bakir, allowed him to mount his own steed, and instructed him to deliver it in person to the prince. He chose him for his intrepidity, his fluency of speech and tactfulness. Mullah Bakir took an unfrequented route, and after a day's journey reached a place called Hudashtak, in the neighborhood of which was a fort around which tribes who roved the country sometimes pitched their tents. Mullah Bakir dismounted near one of these tents, and whilst he was talking with its occupants, Haji Sid Ismail, the Sheikhul Islam of Babanat, arrived. He had obtained leave from Vahid to proceed to his native village on some urgent affair, and to return immediately to Neriz. After his lunch he saw that a richly caparisoned horse was tethered to the ropes of one of the neighbouring tents. Being informed that it belonged to one of the friends of Zainul Abidin Khan, who had arrived from Neriz and was on his way to Shiraz, Haji Sid Ismail, who was a man of exceptional courage, immediately went to that tent, mounted the horse, and unsheathing his sword, sternly spoke these words to the owner of the tent, with whom Mullah Bakir was still conversing. "Arrest this scoundrel who has fled from before the face of the Sahibuz Saman. Tie his hands and deliver him to me." Affrighted by the words and manner of Haji Mullah Ismail, the occupants of the tent immediately obeyed. They bound his hands and delivered the rope with which they had tied him to Haji Sayyid Ismail, who spurred on his charger in the direction of Neriz, and compelled his captive to follow him. At a distance of 2 farsangs from that town, he reached the village of Rastak, and delivered his captive into the hands of its Kadkuda, whose name was Haji Akbar, urging that he be conducted into the presence of Vahid. When brought before him, the latter inquired as to the purpose of his journey to Shiraz, to which he gave a frank and detailed reply. Though Vahid was willing to forgive him, yet Mullah Bakir, by reason of his attitude towards him, was eventually put to death at the hands of the companions. Zainul Abidin Khan, far from relaxing in his determination to solicit the aid he needed from Shiraz, appealed this time with increased vehemence to the prince, begging him to redouble his efforts for the extermination of what he regarded as the gravest menace to the security of his province. Not content with his earnest entreaty, he dispatched to Shiraz a number of his trusted men, whom he loaded with presents for the prince, hoping thereby to induce him to act with promptness. In a further effort to ensure the success of his endeavours, he addressed several appeals to the leading ulamas and seers of Shiraz, wherein he glaringly misrepresented the aims of Vahid, expatiated upon his subversive activities, and urged them to intercede with the prince and entreat him to expedite the dispatch of reinforcements. The prince readily granted their request. He instructed Abdullah Khan, the Shuja-ul Mulk, to set out at once for Neriz, accompanied by the Hamadani and Silakuri regiments, headed by several officers, and provided with an adequate force of artillery. He moreover instructed his representative in Neriz to recruit all the able-bodied men from the surrounding district, including the villages of Istabanat, Iraj, Panj-ma-Din, Khutri, Bashni, Din Shah, Mushkan, and Rastak. To these he added the members of the tribe by the name of Vizbaklariya, whom he commanded to join the army of Zainul Abidin Khan. An innumerable host suddenly surrounded the fort in which Vahid and his companions were besieged, and began to dig trenches around it and to set up barricades along these trenches. No sooner was the work accomplished than they opened fire on them. A bullet struck the horse on which one of Vahid's attendants was riding as he was keeping watch on the gate. Another bullet followed immediately upon the first and penetrated the turret above that gate. In the course of that bombardment, one of the companions, aiming with his rifle at one of the officers in charge of the artillery, shot him dead instantly, as a result of which the roar of the guns was immediately silenced. The assailants meanwhile retreated and hid themselves within their trenches. That night neither the besieged nor those who attacked them ventured to sally forth from their places of shelter. The second night, however, Vahid summoned Ghulam Rizai-i-Yazdi and instructed him, together with 14 of his companions, to sally forth from the fort and drive off the enemy. Those who were called upon to perform that task were for the most part of advanced age, whom no one would have thought capable of bearing the brunt of so fierce a struggle. Among them was a shoemaker who, though more than 90 years of age, showed such enthusiasm and vigor as no youth could hope to exceed. The rest of the 14 were mere lads, as yet wholly unprepared to face the perils and endure the strain which such a sally entailed. Age, however, to those heroes whom a dauntless will and an immovable confidence in the high destiny of their cause had wholly transformed, mattered but little. They were instructed by their leader to divide immediately after they left the cover of the fort, and raising simultaneously the cry of Allahu Akbar, to spring into the midst of the enemy. No sooner had the signal been given than they rose and, hurrying to their steeds and rifles, marched out of the gate of the fort. Undaunted by the fire which spouted from the mouths of the cannons and by the bullets which rained upon their heads, they plunged headlong into the midst of their adversaries. This sudden encounter lasted for no less than 8 hours, during which that fearless band was able to demonstrate such skill and bravery as amazed the veterans in the ranks of the enemy. From the town of Neriz, as well as from its surrounding fortifications, reinforcements rushed to the aid of the small company that had withstood so valiantly the combined forces of a whole army. As the scope of the struggle extended, the voices of the women of Neriz, who had rushed to the roofs of their houses to acclaim the heroism which was being so strikingly displayed, were raised from every side. Their exulting cheers swelled the roar of the guns, which acquired added intensity by the shout of Allahu Akbar, which the companions, in a frenzy of excitement, raised amidst that tumult. The uproar caused by their womenfolk, their amazing audacity and self-confidence, utterly demoralized their opponents and paralyzed their efforts. The camp of the enemy was desolate and forsaken, and offered a sad spectacle as the victors retraced their steps to the fort. They carried with them, in addition to those who were grievously wounded, no less than 60 dead, among whom were the following: 1. Ghulam Rizai-i-Yazdi, not to be confounded with the captain of the forces who bore that same name. 2. Brother of Ghulam Rizai-i-Yazdi. 3. Ali, son of Khairullah. 4. Qaji Hussein-i-Qanad, son of Qaji Ghani. 5. Asghar, son of Mullah Mehdi. 6. Kabilai Abdul Karim. 7. Hussein, son of Mashhadi Muhammad. 8. Zainul Abidin, son of Mashhadi Baqir-i-Sabah. 9. Mullah Jafar-i Muzahib. 10. Abdullah, son of Mullah Musa. 11. Muhammad, son of Mashhadi Rajabi Haddad. 12. Kabilai Hassan, son of Kabilai Shamsuddin-i Maliki Duz. 13. Kabilai Mirza Muhammad Izari. 14. Kabilai Baqir-i Kafsh Duz. 15. Mirza Ahmad, son of Mirza Hussein-i Kashsaz. 16. Mullah Hassan, son of Mullah Abdullah. 17. Mashhadi Haji Muhammad. 18. Abu Talib, son of Mir Ahmad-i Nuqud Biriz. 19. Akbar, son of Muhammad-i Ashur. 20. Taqi-i Yazdi. 21. Mullah Ali, son of Mullah Jafar. 22. Kabilai Mirza Hussein. 23. Hussein Khan, son of Sharif. 24. Kabilai Qurban. 25. Qaji Qazim, son of Qaji Ali. 26. Akka, son of Haji Ali. 27. Mirza Naura, son of Mirza Muina. So complete a failure convinced Zainul Abidin Khan and his staff of the futility of their efforts to compel, in an open contest, the submission of their adversaries. As was the case with the army of Prince Mihdi Quli Mirza, who had miserably failed to subdue his opponents fairly in the field, treachery and fraud proved eventually the sole weapon with which a cowardly people could conquer an invincible enemy. By the devices to which Zainul Abidin Khan and his staff eventually resorted, they betrayed their powerlessness, despite the vast resources at their disposal and the moral support which the governor of Fars and the inhabitants of the whole province had extended to them, to vanquish what to outward appearance seemed but a handful of untrained and contemptible people. In their hearts they were convinced that behind the walls of that fort were clustered a band of volunteers which no force at their command could face and defeat. By raising the cry of peace, they sought, through such base cunning, to beguile those pure and noble hearts. For a few days they suspended all manner of hostility, after which they addressed a solemn and written appeal to the besieged, which in substance ran as follows: Hitherto, as we were ignorant of the true character of your faith, we have allowed the mischief-makers to induce us to believe that every one of you has violated the sacred precepts of Islam. Therefore did we arise against you and have endeavored to extirpate your faith. During the last few days we have been made aware of the fact that your activities are untinged by any political motive, that none of you cherish any inclination to subvert the foundations of the state. We also have been convinced of the fact that your teachings do not involve any grave departure from the fundamental teachings of Islam. All that you seem to uphold is the claim that a man has appeared whose words are inspired and whose testimony is certain, and whom all the followers of Islam must recognize and support. We can in no wise be convinced of the validity of this claim unless you consent to repose the utmost confidence in our sincerity and accept our request to allow certain of your representatives to emerge from the fort and meet us in this camp, where we can, within the space of a few days, ascertain the character of your belief. If you prove yourselves able to demonstrate the true claims of your faith, we too will readily embrace it, for we are not the enemies of truth, and none of us wish to deny it. Your leader we have always recognized as one of the ablest champions of Islam, and we regard him as our example and guide. This Quran, to which we affix our seals, is the witness to the integrity of our purpose. Let that holy book decide whether the claim you advance is true or false. The malediction of God and his Prophet rest upon us if we should attempt to deceive you. Your acceptance of our invitation will save a whole army from destruction, whilst your refusal will leave them in suspense and doubt. We pledge our word that as soon as we are convinced of the truth of your message, we shall strive to display the same zeal and devotion you already have so strikingly manifested. Your friends will be our friends, and your enemies our enemies. Whatever your leader may choose to command, the same we pledge ourselves to obey. On the other hand, if we fail to be convinced of the truth of your claim, we solemnly promise that we shall in no wise interfere with your safe return to the fort, and shall be willing to resume our contest against you. We entreat you to refuse to shed more blood before attempting to establish the truth of your cause. Fahid received the Koran with great reverence and kissed it devoutly. Our appointed hour has struck, he remarked. Our acceptance of their invitation will surely make them feel the baseness of their treachery. Though I am well aware of their designs, he added as he turned to his companions, I feel it my duty to accept their call and take the opportunity to attempt once again to unfold the verities of my beloved faith. He bade them continue to discharge their duties and place no reliance whatever on what their adversaries might profess to believe. He, moreover, ordered them to suspend all manner of hostilities until further notice from him. With these words he bade farewell to his companions, and accompanied by 5 attendants, among whom were Mullah Ali-i Muzahib and the treacherous Haji Sayyid Abid, set out for the camp of the enemy. Zainul Abidin Khan, accompanied by Shuja-ul Mulk and all the members of his staff, came out to welcome him. They ceremoniously received him, conducted him to a tent that had been specially pitched for his reception, and introduced him to the rest of the officers. He seated himself upon a chair, while the rest of the company, with the exception of Zainul Abidin Khan, Shujaul Mulk, and another officer whom he motioned to be seated, all stood before him. The words in which he addressed them were such that even a stone-hearted man could not fail to feel their power. Baha'u'llah, in the Suri-i-Sabr, has immortalized that noble appeal and revealed the full measure of its significance. "I am come to you," Vahid declared, "armed with the testimony with which my Lord has entrusted me. Am I not a descendant of the Prophet of God? Wherefore should you have risen to slay me? For what reason have you pronounced my death sentence and refused to recognize the undoubted rights with which my lineage has invested me?" The majesty of his bearing, combined with his penetrating eloquence, confounded his hearers. For 3 days and 3 nights they lavishly entertained him and treated him with marked respect. In their congregational prayer they invariably followed his lead and attentively listened to his discourse. Though outwardly they seemed to be bowing to his will, yet they were secretly plotting against his life, and were conspiring to exterminate the remnant of his companions. They knew full well that, were they to inflict upon him the least injury while his companions remained entrenched behind the walls of their fort, they would be exposing themselves to a peril still greater than the one they had already been compelled to face. They trembled at the fury and vengeance of their women no less than at the bravery and skill of their men. They realized that all the resources of the enemy had been powerless to subdue a handful of immature lads and decrepit old men. Nothing short of a bold and well-conceived stratagem would ensure their ultimate victory. The fear that filled their hearts was to a great extent inspired by the words of Zainul Abidin Khan, who, with unrelaxing determination, sought to maintain undiminished the hatred with which he had inflamed their souls. Vahid's repeated exhortations had aroused his apprehensions lest he should succeed by the magic of his words in inducing them to transfer their allegiance to so eloquent an opponent. Zainul Abidin Khan and his friends at last decided to request Vahid to address in his own handwriting a message to his companions who were still within the fort, to inform them that an amicable settlement of their differences had been effected, and to urge them either to join him at the headquarters of the army or to return to their homes. Though reluctant to give his consent to such a request, Vahid was eventually forced to submit. In addition to this message, he confidentially informed his companions in a second letter of the evil designs of the enemy and warned them not to allow themselves to be deceived. He entrusted both letters to Haji Sayyid Abid, instructing him to destroy the former and deliver the latter to his companions. He charged him, moreover, to urge them to choose the ablest among their number and to sally forth in the dead of night and scatter the forces of the enemy. No sooner had Haji Sayyid Abid received these directions than he treacherously communicated them to Zainul Abidin Khan. The latter immediately sought to induce him to urge the occupants of the fort, in the name of their leader, to disperse, promising that he would in return abundantly reward him. The disloyal messenger delivered the first letter to Vahid's companions and informed them that their leader had succeeded in winning over to his faith the entire army, and that in view of this conversion he had advised them to leave for their homes. Though extremely bewildered by such a message, the companions felt unable to disregard the wishes Vahid had so clearly expressed. They reluctantly dispersed, leaving all the fortifications unguarded. Obedient to the commands written by their leader, several of them discarded their arms and directed their steps towards Neriz. Zainul Abidin Khan, anticipating the immediate evacuation of the fort, dispatched a detachment of his forces to intercept their entry into the town. They were soon encompassed by a multitude of armed men who were being continually reinforced from the army's headquarters. Finding themselves thus unexpectedly hemmed in, they determined by every means in their power to repulse the attack and gain the Masjid-i-Jami as swiftly as possible. By the aid of swords and rifles, which some of them were carrying, others with sticks and stones only, they sought to force their way to the town. The cry, "Allahu Akbar," rose again, fiercer and more compelling than ever. A few among them suffered martyrdom as they forced their way through the ranks of their treacherous assailants. The rest, though wounded and harassed by fresh reinforcements which had beset them from every side, eventually succeeded in attaining the shelter of the masjid. Meanwhile, the notorious Mullah Hassan, the son of Mullah Muhammad Ali, an officer in the army of Zainul Abidin Khan, succeeded, together with his men, in outdistancing his opponents and, concealing himself in one of the minarets of that masjid, lay in wait for the fugitives. No sooner had the scattered band approached the masjid than he opened fire upon them. A certain Mullah Hussein recognized him, and raising the cry of Allahu Akbar, scaled the minaret, aimed his rifle at that cowardly officer, and hurled him to the ground. His friends carried him away to a place where he was unable to recover from his wound. The companions, unable any longer to obtain shelter in the masjid, were compelled to hide in whatever place of safety they could find, until such time as they might ascertain the fate of their leader. Their first thought, after their betrayal, was to seek his presence and follow whatever instructions he might wish to give them. They were, however, unable to discover what had befallen him, and trembled at the thought that he might have been put to death. Meanwhile, Zainul Abidin Khan and his staff, emboldened by the dispersal of the companions, strenuously exerting themselves to discover means whereby they could evade the obligations of their solemn oath and proceed unhindered to slay their chief opponent. They endeavored by some specious device to set aside their sacred promises and to hasten the fulfillment of a long-cherished desire. In the midst of their deliberations, Abbas Quli Khan, a man notorious for his ruthlessness and cruelty, assured his comrades that if the thought of having taken the oath perplexed them, he himself had in no wise participated in that declaration, and was ready to execute what they felt unable to perform. "I can arrest at any time," he burst forth in a fit of indignation, "and put to death whomsoever I deem guilty of having violated the laws of the land." He immediately afterwards called upon those whose kinsmen had perished to execute the sentence of death pronounced against Vahid. The first to present himself was Mullah Riza, whose brother, Mullah Bakir, had been captured by the Sheikhul Islam of Babanat. The next was a man named Safar, whose brother Shaban had perished. The third was Akhar Khan, whose father, Ali Asghar Khan, elder brother of Zainul Abidin Khan, had suffered the same fate. In their eagerness to carry out the suggestion of Abbas Quli Khan, these men snatched the turban from the head of Vahid, wound it around his neck, and binding him to a horse, dragged him ignominiously through the streets. The indignities that were heaped upon him reminded those who witnessed that awful spectacle of the tragic end of Imam Hussein, whose body was abandoned to the mercy of an infuriated enemy, and upon which a multitude of horsemen pitilessly trampled. The women of Neriz, stirred to the highest pitch of excitement by the shouts of triumph which a murderous enemy was raising, pressed from every side around the corpse, and to the accompaniment of drums and cymbals gave free vent to their feelings of unrestrained fanaticism. They danced merrily around it, scornful of the words which Vahid in the midst of his agony had spoken, words which the Imam Hussein in a former age and in similar circumstances had uttered. "Thou knowest, O my beloved, that I have abandoned the world for thy sake, and have placed my trust in thee alone. I am impatient to hasten to thee, for the beauty of thy countenance has been unveiled to my eyes. Thou dost witness the evil designs which my wicked persecutor has cherished against me. Nay, never will I submit to his wishes or pledge my allegiance to him." Thus was brought to an end a noble and heroic life. Such an eventful and brilliant career, distinguished by such vast learning, such dauntless courage, and so rare a spirit of self-sacrifice, surely required for crown a death as glorious as that which completed his martyrdom. The extinction of that life was the signal for a fierce onslaught on the lives and property of those who had identified themselves with his faith. No less than 5,000 men were commissioned for that villainous task. The men were seized, chained, ill-treated, and eventually slaughtered. The women and children were captured and subjected to brutalities which no pen dare describe. Their property was confiscated and their houses were destroyed. The fort of Kaji was burned to the ground. The majority of the men were first conducted in chains to Shiraz, and there, for the most part, suffered a cruel death. Those whom Zainul Abidin Khan, for purposes of personal benefit, had plunged into dark and subterranean dungeons, were, as soon as his object had been achieved, delivered into the hands of his myrmidons, who perpetrated upon them acts of unspeakable cruelty. They were paraded at first through the streets of Neriz, after which they were subjected to atrocious treatment in the hope of extracting from them whatever material advantage their persecutors had hitherto been unable to obtain. These having satisfied their greed, each victim was made to suffer an agonizing death. Every instrument of torture their executioners could devise was utilized to quench their thirst for revenge. They were branded, their nails were pulled out, their bodies were lashed, an incision was made in the nose through which a string was driven, nails were hammered into their hands and feet, and in that piteous state each one of them was dragged through the streets, an object of contempt and derision to all the people.